and welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Bill Evans, his life and times and best hits. On this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called New Jazz Conceptions. This album launched his career. So these tracks are new jazz conceptions or explorations. So it was still Bill Evans in his early days and a glimpse of things to come. Everybody Digs Bill Evans is the next album. One of the standout features of this album is the cover. It's got beautiful quotations and typography. And this album, it's a mix-up of great original compositions and jazz classics. And an album called Portrait of Jazz. Portrait of Jazz was their first album, released in 1960 on Riverside Records. This album is similar to the previous album, Everybody Digs Bill Evans, in that it spreads the musicianship of the bandmates equally during the performances. The piano playing is beautiful. Bill Evans was one of the best piano players of his day and age. And the real reason for this album's timelessness is the synergy between the bandmates. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up on this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about the life and times of Bill Evans, and on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called New Jazz Conceptions. So the very first album released by an artist is not likely to be their best because they're still honing their craft. This is Bill Evans' debut album, released in 1956, and is no different. He's also recording for the first time as band leader of a trio in this album. This album launched his career. So these tracks are new jazz conceptions. Even back in those days, this album was described by critics as a very good piano jazz album. Bill Evans was famous for his elegant, introverted playing style, but this, his first album, was a bit of a deviation. For example, the opening track, I Love You, a very dynamic, energetic track that echoes the bop musician styles that inspired a young Bill Evans. Also, it's clear in this album that Evans is still reshaping his approach. There's evidence of things to come, like his rhythmic playing on Five and Yesterdays. Also his solo tracks, like Waltz for Debbie, where he showcases graceful chords and swinging tempos. So it was Bill Evans in his early days, and a glimpse of things to come. Another album called Everybody Digs Bill Evans. So one of the standout tracks of this album is its cover. It's got beautiful quotations and typography. Quotes from other jazz legends like Miles Davis, George Shearing, Ahmad Jamal, and Cannonball Adderley. It was 1958 and album cover art was as good as it got with this album cover. And as cool as the cover is, the music is even more spectacular. This was Evans' second recording as band leader of a trio, and in this album it's a mix-up of great original compositions and jazz classics. There's a diverse range of styles like the up-tempo and swinging track Oleo, to cool, slow-paced tracks like What Is There to Say. Also, Evans' technique is very original and accomplished on this album. One of his best tracks from this album is the song Peace Peace, a Leonard Bernstein original. Evans performs it as a beautiful piano solo in this album. He slowly builds up the momentum and suddenly breaks off into short, aggressive melodies. Sam Jones is on bass. One of his best pieces is his majestic and good-humored rendition on the song Tenderly. Also, Philly Joe Jones is on drums, amazing in this album. His Latin-themed rhythms on the song Night and Day are outstanding. An album called Portrait of Jazz. The original Bill Evans trio, consisting of Paul Motian and Scott LaFaro, was short-lived, but it had a profound impact on jazz. They were formed in 1959 and went on to tour the United States. Portrait of Jazz was their first album, released in 1960 on Riverside Records. So this is the definition of free jazz, which is synonymous with avant-garde jazz. And yet the music is far from avant-garde jazz in this album. It features modal jazz, featuring tight arrangements and classical influences. And nevertheless, Bill Evans' music is a genre of its own, featuring his own unique style, which is one of a kind. One of the highlights of this album is Scott LaFaro's bass playing, perfectly complementing Evans' piano melodies. Motion on drums is very impressionistic, as he keeps time to Evans' piano rhythms. One of the standards, Come Rain or Come Shine, and When I Fall in Love are jazz classics, beautiful tailored to fit Evans' style. One particular rendition, the closing track, Blue and Green, showcases how Evans was not just a pianist, but also a pioneer of jazz at his time. So overall, a timeless album. The piano playing is beautiful. Bill Evans was one of the best piano players of his day and age. And the real reason for the album's timelessness is the synergy between the bandmates. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Bill Evans, his life and times and best albums. And now for some trending album news. Danish jazz singer-songwriter Kira Martin is back with a new album called Open Wide. It was released June 21st on Storyville Records. Martin's a prominent jazz icon in the Scandinavian music scene, known for her warm vocals and versatility. So her album Open Wide features a bunch of her own compositions, a diverse range of genres, with a backdrop of 70s theme music influences. So the theme of the album is basically about facing life with an open mind. It features her own personal stories and experiences. Martin believes music is the best way to connect, to heal, and her songs reflect this. The albums explore themes like healing, transformation, love, friendship, and anger. You can purchase the album Open Wide on StoryvilleRecords.com. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Bill Evans' best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Bill Evans, his life and times and best music. On this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called The Complete Village Vanguard Recordings. So this album is taken from an iconic live performance by Bill Evans and his trio at the Village Vanguard, a famous jazz haunt in New York City. This is a great concert piece as it showcases both the artists' individual talent and their ability as a band, one of the best jazz albums in history. You Must Believe in Spring is the next album. This was one of his best albums for Warner Brothers. The music is beautiful and iconic. It's characterized by quiet, exquisite musicianship. The material is flawless and the playing is elegant and tasteful in a trio setting. And an album called Conversations with Myself. This one's an overdubbed piano solo album. It's also one of Evans' early recordings with Verve Records in 1963. So the interesting thing about this album is on each of the 10 tracks, Evans has interlaced 3 piano tracks on top of each other. The album went on to win a Grammy Award. So that's a quick recap of what's coming up on this album, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Bill Evans, his life and times and best hits. And on this hour, we are going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Complete Village Vanguard Recordings. So this album's taken from an iconic live performance by Bill Evans and his trio at the Village Vanguard, a famous haunt in jazz New York City. It was released on Fantasy Records in 1961. Also included in the tracklist is a song called Gloria Step for the first time ever. A beautiful song sporting Scott LaFaro on a bass solo. Another standout track is a Cole Porter classic, All of You. This one is one of the longest songs on the setlist, lasting 8 minutes. In this track, Evans is deep and spiritual after the style of the great Cole Porter. This is a great concert piece as it showcases both the artist's individual talent and their ability as a band. Also, the album became famous for the band's approach and piano tradition in these tracks. Typically, in such a setting, the piano player was given center stage. In this album, all 3 bandmates collaborate equally on the tracks together in synchronicity. So there were 2 albums that resulted from the performances at this concert, Live at the Village Vanguard and Waltz for Debbie. They are considered some of the best jazz albums in history. You Must Believe in Spring is the next album. This one's from Bill Evans' latter days. He'd already made a name for himself on Riverside and Verve Records, and this was one of his best albums for Warner Brothers. He was also having some troubling health issues at the time. So this album was recorded at a trying time for Evans when he was in decline, and in fact the label only released this album after his death in 1980. The album cover is sober, in like form, a melancholy monochrome affair, and yet the music by contrast is beautiful and iconic. It is characterized by quiet, exquisite musicianship. The material is flawless, and the playing is elegant and tasteful in this trio setting. There's an original song by Evans called B Minor Waltz, a booming resonant track that opens up the album. Elliot Zegman's on drums and adds gentle touches to Evans' piano playing. Also, Bill Evans was very much influenced by the compositions of Michael Legrand. There's a soundtrack of a movie from this album titled You Must Believe in Spring, which was written by the great Michael Legrand. Evans included this song as a tribute to his mentor. Eddie Gomez is on electric bass in this song. There's another composition called Gary's Theme, which is retitled Gary's Waltz on this album. This one's portrayed as a slow, melancholy jazz song by the trio. Overall, the album is one of nostalgia and solemnness. Yet it's not all gloom and doom, for the material varies. There's a very upbeat, jaunty soundtrack here called MASH from one of Evans' favorite TV shows. Conversations with Myself is another great album. This one's an overdubbed piano solo album. It's one of Evans' early recordings with Verve Records in 1963. So the interesting thing about this album is, on top of each of the 10 tracks, Evans has overlaced 3 piano tracks on top of each other. So it's like, through his melodies, he's having a conversation with himself. He's improvising with, responding to, and accompanying himself. So this approach was initially considered rather controversial, and critics were divided on this technique. But the album went on to become a massive success and won him a Grammy Award. He repeated the overdub piano technique in two albums that came after that, Further Conversations with Myself in 1967 and New Conversations in 1978. So that was more great hits by Bill Evans, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. Don't forget to check out my YouTube channel for archives of today's show on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode of the Jazz Update, Bill Evans, his life and times and best music. And we've come to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were talking about on today's episode. Bill Evans grew up in New Jersey, where he began collaborating with other jazz greats like Miles Davis. Then he formed his own trio, the Bill Evans Trio. He was famous for his development of piano technique. Evans received 31 Grammy nominations and 7 awards and was inducted into the Downbeat Jazz Hall of Fame. Several of his compositions like Waltz for Debbie and Time Remembered have become jazz classics today. So that was a bit of insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Trio 64. In 1963, Bill recorded Trio 64 alongside Paul Motion on drums and bassist Gary Peacock. This was an album exclusively full of jazz classics. Waltz for Debbie is one of his best-selling albums. Bill Evans recorded this album in his early days in 1961. So this album was recorded towards the end of his famous live concert at the Village Vanguard in New York City. The album features 6 tracks taken from that live event, a vibrant, dynamic album. New Jazz Conceptions. This is Bill Evans' debut album released in 1956. This album launched his career. So these tracks are new jazz conceptions, explorations. It was Bill Evans in his early days and a glimpse of things to come. The Complete Village Vanguard recordings. This album's taken from an iconic live performance by Bill Evans and his trio at the Village Vanguard, famous jazz hall in New York City. And this one's a great concert piece. It showcases both the artists' individual talent and their ability as a band. One of the best jazz albums in history. And Conversations with Myself. This one's an overdubbed piano solo album. It's one of Evans' early recordings with Verve Records in 1963. So the interesting thing about this album is on top of each of the 10 tracks, Evans has overlays 3 piano tracks, one on top of each other. The album went on to win a Grammy Award. So that was a quick insight into everything that we discussed on today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. You can check out my YouTube channel for archives of today's show on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So that brings me to an end of today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.